My name is Nancy Wallace. I am a Student Services Librarian and also the Library Diversity Fellow at the UC Davis Library. And I'm here to talk about some books that I would like to recommend for Black History Month. And all of these books are about the history of the Black American experience, and they're in sort of roughly chronological order. So with that said, I'm going to start with the first one, and this is the 1619 Project. This is the Kindle version. You may have heard of this. The 1619 Project was started by Nikole Hannah-Jones working with the New York Times, and it was the intent of the project is to reframe American history through the lens of the African American experience. And it starts she chose 1619 as the start date because that is what is many historians consider to be the beginning of African slavery in the country that became the United States, when 20 enslaved Africans were brought to the Jamestown colony. And as I said, it's very controversial. Some of the historical takes have been disputed, but also there was tremendous pushback against this idea that we're going to look at American history through an African American lens. And they're actually, in several states, they passed legislation saying that the 1619 Project could not be used as a teaching tool. And this is in the year 2020. So it's very controversial, like I said, but it's also very worth reading. It's not simply a history, it also includes poetry, short fiction, photographs, and it has there are multiple authors who are looking at various aspects of the Black experience. So I think it's definitely worth engaging with as a whole, and not just looking at picking out some of the pieces that people have had disagreements with. The next book is called When and Where I Enter. It's by Paula Giddings. This was actually first published in 1984, and it is about the impact of Black women on race and sex in America. And I first encountered this book when I was getting ready to enter Stanford as a freshman in 1987. And this was one of the books that was recommended by a faculty member that we should read. And my mother insisted that I read all of the books on the list. So I started with this one. And she starts off talking about Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaign as one of the preeminent Black female journalists at the time. One of the things that I think is really her big points is that most of the work up to that point about Black politicians and Black activists focused on men. And most of the information and the works about the suffragist movement focused on white women. So Black women were in this strange liminal space where we kind of didn't really exist. And so this book was intended to counter that narrative and talk about the contributions and the struggles and challenges faced by Black women in particular. So even though it's a little bit dated, I think that a lot of the issues that it raises are still definitely relevant, as we can see, for example, in the current debate over the Supreme Court seat that's about to be filled. This next book is called The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration, and it is focused on the period roughly between 1919 and 1970, when roughly 6 million Black Americans moved from the South to the North and the West. And this was largely in response to Jim Crow in the South, and it was just this massive migration of people who wanted a better life, except it's the traditional immigrant story, but it's within the United States. What I think makes it really effective is that the author, Isabel Wilkerson, focuses on 3 people from different parts of the South who ended up in different parts of the North and West, and sort of traces their story, and then also puts it in the context of the larger movement. But so you have these 3 individuals that you can kind of follow through her story and through the narrative. And it's definitely a big read, but it is very engaging. She's an excellent writer, and it really does illuminate a part of American history that is not often discussed. It's just like sort of, there was the Civil War and then the Civil Rights Movement, but what happened in between that time often is a story that doesn't get told. This book, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, by Mildred D. Taylor, is, unlike the other books I've mentioned so far, this is fiction. It's young adult fiction. It won the Newbery Prize for Best Children's Book in 1977. And I actually, this is sort of something that makes me feel I have a connection with Nikole Hannah-Jones, because in her intro to the 1619 Project book, she talks about going to her library as an elementary school student and seeing this book and pulling it off the shelf because it had a girl who looked like her on the cover, and that's exactly what happened to me. It is about, this is sort of the flip side of the Great Migration, because it's about a girl and her family who stayed in Mississippi, and they were living in Mississippi during the time period between 1919 and 1963. The family is fictional, but they're very much based on her family, and in this edition of the book, she actually includes pictures, family pictures, and she talks about who each character is based on. This is part of a larger series about the Logan family, and what makes them particularly unique at that time and place is that they owned their own land, and that was huge. So she's reading about, Nikole Hannah-Jones is talking about living in Iowa. I was growing up in Chicago. This was all a revelation. They're talking about having to go off of the sidewalk if there was a white person coming, and the night riders, which is what they called the Klan. And I actually talked to my mother about this because my mother grew up in the South in around this time, and she was like, yeah, that's kind of what it was like. So it was, even though there was a lot separating me from Cassie, I really felt a kinship with her, especially when after talking to my mother. So this was a really formative book for me, honestly. One of the things about Cassie is that she wants to grow up and be a writer and a lawyer, and that was definitely something that I could relate to. So, continuing on in time, this is March. It is actually a 3 graphic novel set, and it tells the story of the late Congressman John Lewis, who was a very pivotal member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. He famously got beaten on the March for Voting Rights across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And this is his autobiography, only it's in graphic novel form. And it was published between the first book came out in 2013, the last book came out in 2016. And it is absolutely fantastic. He talks about both himself and his story and the story of the movement. It goes right up through the March on Washington, which he was a very important part of. He talks about the Some of this is pretty harrowing, like when he's talking about his experiences in jail in Alabama, and the deaths of many civil rights workers, the assassination of Medgar Evers. But what is especially interesting is the way that he frames it, which is, it starts off, one of the earliest sections is talking about, is set at, with John Lewis getting ready to attend Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009. And that leads me, that leads me to this one. We Were 8 Years in Power. And this is by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a very an amazing writer. And I first discovered him in the late aughts when he was writing for The Atlantic. And this book includes a lot of his columns from The Atlantic. And he's specifically talking about, he has one that was written for each year of the Obama presidency. But he's not just talking about Obama, because he's talking about the political impact and sort of the political threads that had led to Obama from the Black experience. And it's subtitled An American Tragedy, because essentially his thesis is that white America, the one thing that white America was not prepared to deal with was a competent, accomplished Black man in power. And that directly led to Trump and Trumpism, and that we still haven't come to a reckoning with that. So I think that as a sort of through line, you can see where you start with 1619 and you get to the present. They're very different takes on the events that happened, but I think in order to look at Black history, that's such a big subject. You can't just look at one aspect. You have to look at a variety of perspectives, and that will help you get a clear picture. So these are my recommendations, and thank you.